So today's Snapshot PD is going to touch on, there we go, is going to touch on two things, goals and what the thought of ambitious goals, the different components of goals, and what to consider as we're writing goals. And then we're going to move into progress reporting, which obviously these two are very related. When it comes to goals, we need to keep in mind a couple things. First of all is legally, goals are a part of every IEP. This definition here of, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. This is just the legal requirement for goals and why we have to have goals on the IEP. Every IEP must contain goals, and really goals should be focusing on each area of need that an IEP team feels a student has. And so the goal is a promise to a parent that we are going to aim to achieve a certain level or try to improve a certain thing by a certain level. And so if we see concerns with reading, writing, and math, we should consider goals in reading, writing, and math. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a goal for everyone, but we need to at least consider it and as an IEP team, determine why that area of need wouldn't be addressed through a goal. The other side of the legal requirement around goals is this definition of appropriately ambitious in light of the student circumstances. Up until about 5 or 6 years ago, any level of progress was seen as okay for a student with a disability. So a student could make even a minimum amount of progress, and you could say that IEP was being effective for that student. But about 4 or 5 years ago, there's a case called Andrew F. that re-examined that definition of appropriate progress and determined that appropriate progress is now appropriately ambitious in light of the student circumstances. So each IEP team should be targeting appropriately ambitious goals for any given student based off of their own circumstances. So some students, the minimum amount of progress might still be appropriate based on their circumstances, but for other students, we need to be aiming higher than that. And so this just set the standard of what special ed and what our focus should be on, that appropriately ambitious. So what that means is we want to make sure that the goals we are aiming for are achievable, but also pushing students to a higher level of achievement or pushing them towards graduation or other outcomes that we know every student should be being set up for. So that's why we have goals, but what do we need to have in goals? KSDE, when they talk about measurable goals, they say that each goal needs to have these 4 elements. It needs to have a time frame, which is how long is it going to take for us to reach this goal. It needs to have a condition, which is in what circumstances will we know that this behavior should be happening or this improvement should be happening. The behavior, which is what is that the student going to be able to do better, and then the criteria. At what level of accuracy or fluency do they need to be achieving? So when you have all 4 of those components, you have a measurable goal in the legal framework. In KSD, we do, or in WCK-SEC, we do recommend that goals be limited to just the only the required elements. Goals can be appropriate with a whole bunch of other information in it, but it complicates it, and we'll talk about how it complicates it here in a little bit. But looking at these goal examples, when we talk about time frame, condition, behavior, criteria, think about that 1, 2, 3, 4. These examples demonstrate which part of these goals are meeting each criteria, each requirement. So by May 2020, that's obviously a time frame. When given a grade level reading fluency passage, that's the condition. We've set the stage for what the student is going to be able to do. Fred will read. They will read. That's the behavior. That should always be a verb. And then 95 correct words per minute. That's the criteria, the level that we hope that they will achieve. And with these different examples, you'll see time frame, condition, behavior, and criteria. And it just goes to each one. And I like to write my goals just in that same format. you can write them in different ways and they'll still be accurate, but this way help me remember how to, or help me make sure that my goals met the requirements that the state would required. When it comes to benchmarks and objectives, in our co-op, we recommend that all goals include benchmarks and objectives. And while they are not legally required for every IEP, I think that they support better parent communication and better parent understanding of the progress that is reported. So if we don't have those benchmarks, then parent sees student is able to read 45 words per minute. If they don't have a context for what that means, is that as far as we wanted them to be at this point in the school year? Is that okay for grade level? If we don't have that context, it's just harder to for a parent to know, is this appropriate or not? And when people don't have certainty or don't have a good understanding, then they start to tell their own stories, and they might say that, oh, that score is not high enough, or that's not where we wanted to be at this point. But really, it might still be appropriate. We want those benchmarks and objectives help us be able to communicate better to parents what the context of that score is. And by doing the thinking about it when you're writing the goal in those benchmarks or objectives, it takes away all the stress of when you're doing progress reports of having to think through, now what would be appropriate for this student? What would be appropriate has already been determined, and now you just have to connect the dots instead of draw the dots. When we're selecting goals, we've talked about how to write them, but when you're selecting goals, each service type should have a goal. It might be a shared goal across providers. So you might have a student that's working on pragmatic language. They might have trying to address how they interact with others in a social emotional context. They might have a communication need and a social emotional need that both might be being met by the same goal, or you might have separate goals. But shared goals just mean that two providers or two areas of need are being addressed through one goal. When you're selecting, you want to consider the missing skills and the potential root causes that are affecting the progress in the general education curriculum. So what skills are difficult for this student, and what other things might be causing the challenges that we're seeing, and have goals that are addressing those. So select the skills that would have the biggest impact if it were to improve. So sometimes with reading, we have accuracy, fluency, and comprehension concerns. The one that's probably going to have the biggest impact is probably accuracy, because once they're accurate, they'll become more fluent and they'll understand more. So, but thinking through logically, what's the one skill that if it gets better, a whole bunch of other areas are likely to get better. And that prevents us from selecting too many goals while still feeling like we're addressing all the needs that we see. Okay, so after you've written the goal, you've gotten through the IEP, now we're getting to those quarterly points of where we have to report progress. When we're selecting the tools for progress monitoring, of course, as you're writing goals, you want to be thinking of the tools that you will be able to support measuring that goal. Consider the tools that are already being used. We already have FastBridge, classroom assessments, different behavior reporting that's being done in our buildings. Use that stuff first if it's applicable to the skill you're trying to improve. We don't need to go reinvent the wheel or have these extra steps if there's already assessment that's collecting the data that we need. But sometimes it doesn't fit perfectly. So consider assessments that do align with the skills. These tools need to be responsive to change over time, and they need to be able to be used throughout the IEP year. So if a student is going to be moving to a different grade level or a different school the next year, we want to make sure that we're picking assessments that can be used in both settings. When nothing else fits, when those tools that are already being used don't fit, we want to consider things like rubrics, teacher-created assessments, or other assessments that we might have available that measure the skill that we're trying to address. Okay. And then when we're writing progress reports, once we know which tool we're going to use, progress reports need to be done each quarter for each goal. And at a minimum, progress reporting must address the goal or the benchmark as it is written. So this is why we want to make sure we don't have too much extra put into our goals, because any detail that is in that goal needs to be included in the progress report. So if we say that student will achieve 100 words per minute, or will read 100 words per minute on 4 out of 5 trials, then our progress reporting has to mention how many trials, and it has to address 4 out of 5 specifically when we're reporting. That means we have to assess that student 5 times in order to be able to accurately report progress for that student. It's much easier and much cleaner if we have a goal that just states they will read this level and leave the trials out. Sometimes, though, we do inherit goals that include that extra detail, and we must be sure that we are reporting progress exactly as the goal is written. So now I've seen progress reports that have been 2 or 3 paragraphs long. I've also seen some that have been 5 words long, and both I think are wrong in different directions. We want to make sure that that progress report is communicating to parents what we expect it to communicate. And there's a few things, anytime we communicate with parents, I like to use the EPIC structure to help support that communication. First in EPIC is the engage. So starting with an engaging sentence, such as Johnny has worked hard on his math facts, some way of acknowledging that, hey, we're here about more than just the facts. We're here about how Johnny is doing or how the student is doing. Then we include a statement about performance. So what is that performance in relation to the goal, with the exact same assessment or the exact same skill that that goal was addressing. So when given his most recent math fact assessment, Johnny got 75% correct. So then we put that into context. Parents may be able to read the score, but they don't know what that necessarily means. So we put that context in there in this way. So this is still below his goal of 85% correct, but it is higher than his performance last quarter, which was 50%. Johnny is on track to meet his goal. And then a concrete plan. Anytime we're communicating with parents about the performance, they're going to want to know, well, what's next? We want to include a statement of what we're going to do going forward. And in this case, we will continue with Johnny's IEP as it is written. That concrete plan, though, if a student is scoring lower than we expected, we might say, we'll monitor this for another month, and then we may schedule another meeting if we aren't seeing improvement. But some way of letting parents know that just if the performance isn't where we want it to be, we're going to figure out a way to address it. We're going to adjust our instruction, we're going to adjust our assessment, or maybe we need to meet and re-talk about the things that Johnny is needing. So here's that full example. Johnny has worked hard on his math facts. When given his most recent math fact assessment, Johnny got 75% correct. This is still below his goal of 85% correct, but is higher than his performance last quarter, which was 50%. Johnny is on track to meet his goal. We will continue with Johnny's IEP as it is written. Again, it's short, compact, it's a paragraph, but you don't need to include every single thing that Johnny did related to math in that quarter. It's just talking about this particular goal and the specifics around that. Okay, so that's all the content for Snapchat PD. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over for questions from the audience. So Mandy, Molly, Sharice, Lynette, do you guys have any questions regarding goals or progress reporting?
So if the student, okay, how do I word this? If the student isn't meeting the benchmark, and in our progress report, we write, we will continue to monitor this for the next month. After that month, if no progress is seen, we will meet. I mean, would we consider that an amendment meeting, or what if we just meet with the teachers and say,
So that meeting is just a meeting to talk about what needs to be different for Johnny. It might include an amendment. It might mean changing the service times. It might just be changing how we're teaching Johnny during his service times. But there'd be some way of a meeting between staff, and I would encourage with parents, if appropriate, to talk about why do we think this goal isn't being met, and what do we need to do to fix it. Right. So the reason that we have those progress points is that we don't want it to be where we've waited a whole year and realized, oh, this didn't work for Johnny, and now we're scrambling to figure out what would work next. We have an active obligation to be making sure that the plan is working for Johnny, and this just is at those checkpoints to help us make those decisions. Okay. Good. Great question.
I have a question kind of regarding that, Kyle.
Yes.
This is Linda.
Yes, Lynette.
You know, there's the little yes, no boxes. I've been hesitant sometimes to check that no when they're not quite making their progress, because I guess I thought that if you weren't making the progress, you needed to amend it somehow or make a new goal or change something. But if we address that, like if they're continuing to make gains, they're making headway, but they're just not quite where they need to be, I think we're okay, correct?
Correct. Yeah, and it's okay to for a student to miss a goal. Obviously, we don't want that. We want to be aiming for a goal and we want to be trying to meet that goal every chance we can. But when we're predicting something in the future, we aren't sure. We think it's going to work. We've picked strategies that we know have worked with other students or that have worked with this student in the past, but we don't know. There might be a reason that a student doesn't meet a goal, and we want to accurately describe that to parents. But then we also want to be problem solving around it. It might mean changing something, but it might just mean let's give it a little bit more time and see. And it just kind of depends on the skill, how far they missed the goal by or the target by. It really comes down to truly a problem solving aspect of it. Of do we know why? Maybe we don't. Is this just an anomaly in the, maybe there were several missed sessions. We're going to work on attendance, or maybe need to rethink the schedule that we're meeting on. But it's problem solving. It doesn't necessarily mean that we, as the IEP team, didn't do everything appropriately, but for some reason the plan didn't work like we thought it would, and we have to address that in some way.
Thank you.
Yes, very good. So I'll send this to you all as well. So there's 2 documents that I've created to support this training. One is this measurable annual goals. It goes along with this. It includes the different criteria, different examples, kind of the legal requirements of the goals that we talked about, the 4 critical components of a well-written goal or a measurable goal, the examples, of course, goes into the appropriately ambitious and the stranger test that I didn't really touch on here, but really goals. The reason why we want to make sure goals can be measured, in more than one setting is if the kid moves, we want to make sure that a goal can still be done. That's one thing I didn't mention is instead of noting on FastBridge, I would recommend using more generic terms such as on a reading curriculum-based measure, or on a math curriculum-based measure, or some other type of on a district-wide assessment, something like that, that even if they move to another district, that if they don't have FastBridge, they can still write a progress report off of that. It's just so much easier than even if they just move from La Crosse to Ellis, even though they're still in the same co-op, sometimes that can throw wrenches in our reporting. This goes into the benchmarks and objectives. This goes into a lot more detail of when the difference between benchmarks and objectives. I'm not going to use the time now to do that, but there's something helpful there. And then in reporting, progress reporting, examples of EPIC. Obviously, the example I gave in the training is straight from this. And then the other document that I've created is those that are using FastBridge, helping determine which goals and which assessments are appropriate for which type of goal. And so this breaks down the different assessments from FastBridge, whether they're teacher administered, computer administered, which ones are recommended based off the grade level, depending on the skill that you're looking at, and then which assessments and what do they measure. And then some information about the norms, again, which help give the context that we've talked about. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts around goals? Okay. Well, if there are questions, of course, you can direct them to myself, or Karen is really good about this stuff as well. But otherwise, I appreciate your guys' time. I'll put you guys down on Frontline for your attendance here, and I'll send you the handouts and the slides right after this. So thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Kyle.
Appreciate you guys' time.
Have a wonderful evening.
You too.